welcome to the MessianTics Podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now, here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
Hey everybody, this is Rabbi Jonathan, and today we kind of wanted to kick off a conversation about what are some of the commandments and practices we keep as Messianic believers that distinguish Messianic Judaism from normative Judaism and distinguish it from Christianity at large, as most of Christianity tends to be interpreted, and why we see some of the problems we see in Messianic Judaism due to not doing certain things or doing certain things. And so one of the questions that I had that we were talking about briefly before we started is oftentimes people will bring up complaints about Messianic leadership, those who purport to be Messianic believers, Messianic rabbis, Messianic pastors, what have you, will participate in things that are, I would say, questionably could be not associated with anything Jewish. For example, eating and handling things that are unkosher. So, for example, we know of people, we've been to places and events where, you'll have Messianic leaders involved with eating things like pork products, shrimp products, shellfish, things like that. And so what I kind of want to throw out to all of y'all and what we'll begin discussing is, what is that? Does that reveal anything about the Messianic movement? Does it cause problems in the Messianic movement? And of course, I have my own opinions about these things too. But yeah.
I just want to say that when we had this discussion before the show, this is Rabbi Toby. When we had this brief discussion before we hit record, I was like, I have never been around another Messianic leader who didn't keep kosher, or at least to my knowledge. Like, I've never sat next to another rabbi or another prominent Messianic leader or, someone in leadership, like that. I've never sat with them and watched them eat like shrimp or crab or, pork or anything like that. That's just, now I have experienced in the congregations I've attended over the years. Now, I have known congregants personally, or members of congregations over the years that I've attended that didn't feel led, and they're usually not Jewish. In fact, I think in all my experiences, other congregants and other members of congregations that I've attended, I think all of them have not been Jewish. Like I said, so this is something that I'm not, that if I have spent time with like someone who's prominent in the movement or in leadership, I had no idea they were eating. I guess in my naivety, if I'm saying that right, I don't know. Naivete. I guess I just assumed that, if you're Jewish, especially, and I'm not, and you're in leadership. If you're in leadership and you're called to the movement, I just assume that, you're keeping kosher and those things. And let me just preface this. I'm sure one of you would have already done it, but this isn't about a salvation stance.
Yeah.
This isn't about saying, oh, well, they're not. This has nothing to do with their salvation and their sealed justification in Yeshua. We're talking about their outward expression as people called in the Messianic movement. What it makes. But when you did share that with me, Jonathan, and with us, it made me think of, it's kind of silly to see some, Messianic Jews stand there and say, well, Gentiles don't need to keep this stuff. I'm like, well, man, some of y'all aren't keeping it, you mean?
Yeah.
And you're going to tell me I can't keep it and some of y'all aren't doing it? But you're going to stand up there and give me a whole presentation about how, well, we need to be careful about, what we let Gentiles do in the movement. And I'm like, well, that's a silly argument when if indeed a lot of leadership isn't even doing that stuff.
Yeah, I think that's my favorite part of this entire conversation is that
so often we hear or read Messianic leaders say, well, look, guys, the Torah is for Jews. Like, that's a Jewish thing, and Gentiles don't necessarily have to do it, and they should, they could, and the way I always, and I'm half joking when I say it this way, but I think there really are some of this is their mentality, that I think a lot of these leaders are like, hey, this Jewish stuff is our stuff, this Torah stuff is our stuff, it's for the Jews, it's not for the Gentiles. You Gentiles can still come because we definitely need your money to pay the mortgage. But aside from that, like, the Torah is ours. And so we're saying this like, oh, keeping kosher, that's a Jewish thing. Like, that's obligatory on Jews, and so Jews should do it. But then there are so many Messianic leaders who out one side will say that Torah stuff, that's only for Jews. And then out the other side, like, not actually live it in any regard. And look, I'm not even talking about whether you're keeping kashrut as the Orthodox or the ultra-Orthodox would, right? I'm not talking about even down to mixing meat and dairy and whether or not you should or should. Like, we're talking about, like, rabbis sitting down with giant plates of bacon at breakfast at a Messianic conference. Like, things like this that are just super obvious. Or, I've heard conversations with Messianic leaders talking about how much they love lobster and where the best lobster is to get and da-da-da. And I'm like, what in the world is happening here?
Yeah, now it's important to kind of state that Messianic Judaism is not a denomination. It's not structured in that way, and there are variants. For instance, we're talking about kashrut right now, but for instance, Sabbath observance. There are those that will not shop or buy or go out to eat or whatever on Shabbat, and then there's other leaders that will leave their synagogue,
go to Red Lobster
with their congregation and go to Red Lobster or somewhere, and even if they're eating food that's kosher,
just for the chicken strips.
So when we talk about when we talk about the things that's so funny. Years ago, just a side joke between Rabbi Jonathan and I. Years ago, there was a young man and his wife who. It was their anniversary. They didn't have any money to go out, and my wife and I decided we were going to bless them with the meal. And I said, well, where do you want to go? And they said, we want to go to Red Lobster. And I was like, oh, I don't want to go to Red Lobster. What am I going to find to eat there and all that? But we go, and I said, I'll just eat a salad, or I'll do something to be there, just drink tea or whatever if I can't find anything at all. And then we get there and they ordered chicken tenders. Like, why do you go to Red Lobster to order chicken tenders and make me come to Red Lobster with you to watch you eat chicken tenders?
Maybe they just wanted those rolls.
Yeah, maybe it was the rolls or the biscuits or whatever they have. But anyhow, to get back to the actual discussion at hand after the Rabbi Trail, we have to understand that there's a vast pendulum swing within the Messianic movement, and many of the leaders, especially the ones that are older leaders within the movement, they came out of a church background. They were believers in a Assembly of God church or a Methodist church or Presbyterian church or some kind of flavor of church, and they came to a place of understanding that as a Jewish person, they could identify as Jewish and follow a Judaism while being a believer in Yeshua. And so they came out, and in that transition, not everyone that made that transition then said, okay, we should do this. And I can tell you from my experience, I was raised in traditional Judaism, and then I became a believer after a period of agnosticism, and became a believer in a church and was told, now that you're a Christian, you don't have to do any of that Jewish stuff. And so I believed that for a period of time. And then I came to Messianic Judaism, and then I became a leader in a Messianic congregation in Mobile, Alabama. And the very first oneg that I attended at that congregation on a Saturday afternoon, there was shrimp and pork ribs and all of that. And that was not, didn't seem contradictory to me because of where I was at that moment in my return to Judaism. I had not traversed from the mindset of you don't have to do all of these things to be a believer to, okay, now that I'm a believer, there are things that I should do because I'm a believer. And so the very first oneg we had was a barbecue, and there was shrimp on the barbie and pork ribs and baked beans with pork in it, and all that stuff. Green beans or whatever we had, everything had pork in it. And then as
you also had the very unlucky fact of being in the South when you came to faith.
Yeah, and there was what was the crawfish. That they sucked the heads out of and stuff.
Right.
So, but that was in my transition period of time. Now, there's no way in the world we would have any of that stuff at an oneg now at our synagogue, or I would even participate in it. But that was my journey. But so I want to be, clear that by saying the things we're saying right now, we're looking at things through the lens of where we are. And in some way judging how we would react or how we would look at something. We want to be careful to say that we're not bashing people who have not made the journey or are not in the same place as we are, because the bottom line is that people in churches, there are people in churches that don't know anything about kashrut, that don't know anything about Shabbat, that are more advanced in some places in their walk with God than any of the four of us sitting at this table who are rabbis, because their journey was different and they got, that we grow in different ways. So we just want to present this stuff from the position of where we are in our growth. And in order to do that, we have to discuss where other people are and where we were before this.
And truthfully, our name says it all. Like, the podcast name is the MessianTics Podcast, and Messianic Judaism is a messy reality. That's just how it is. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of different opinions and thoughts on how things should be done or shouldn't be done. There's a vast array, and as Rabbi Eric said, there isn't a kind of denominational approach. It's not like there's a baseline. Our baseline belief within at least the one rabbinic organization that we're all a part of, the IMCS, kind of the baseline belief, and there are statement of faith, but they're pretty simplistic. The baseline belief is: do you believe that Yeshua was the Messiah? Do you believe in the prophetic purpose of the revival of Israel? Do you believe in the prophetic purpose of the reestablishment of Israel, the modern state of Israel, and
do you believe that Yeshua Zionistic is God? Do you believe that the Bible is the Word of God?
And so there's not really a baseline in terms of obedience or observance. There's a baseline in like the faith step.
Right.
Where are we?
And as we talk about this, and we are MessianTics, so we are talking largely about what's within the Messianic movement, we want to understand that while we're talking about the Messianic movement in the greater Jewish world, even, for instance, we're about to enter into Passover season in about a month. I have seen and experienced Jewish people who would observe Passover by getting all of the leaven out of their house, but then put ham on their matzah as they eat it, or they have no problem with not following the biblical kashrut of pork or shellfish or whatever, but they would not think about eating leavened bread during Passover.
And that brings up an interesting aspect of the conversation too, is because of the fact that there isn't a baseline within Messianic Judaism, it's not a denominational baseline of practice or what have you. The reality is as Rabbi Eric was just saying, there's different varieties of Judaism, if you want to call it that, right? You've got different denominations of Judaism: Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, and then varieties within each of those, right? There's varying breakdowns from there, and none of us agree on how to do anything, much less everything.
Yeah, I actually attend events at the local Reform temple, and they'll have unkosher food at the events that they're having, while the conservative synagogue would not even think about that, and that's within normative Judaism.
And so you've got like people coming in, he was talking about the journeys that we're on and so on. You got people coming in who are coming from a Reform background, who had no connection to kashrut at all, right? Yeah. Even observing Pesach and not having having matzah at a Seder was more cultural than it was a faith act or a practice based in belief. It was just a cultural thing. This is what we do, and this tells this story and whatever, versus your more Orthodox leaning, where it's very much like we do this on a regular basis. This is who we are. This is what we believe. This is an outward expression of our internal belief. And then even conservative within, where yes, at a conservative synagogue for Oneg Shabbat, it would be very common that they're like very strict on how kosher they keep things at the synagogue. Separate refrigerators, separate utensils, separate dishes, and so on. But then all of them, including the rabbis, will leave and go eat whatever they want.
Right. As a matter of fact, the local conservative synagogue, who I'm very good friends with the rabbi of, they have a very kosher kitchen in their synagogue, but then they'll host events, for instance, at a local steakhouse where they don't have a kosher kitchen, where it's not. So there is a flow of observance within not just the message. So when we talk about the flow of observance, or the pendulum swing of observance within the Messianic community, that exists outside the Messianic community in the Jewish community, and outside of the Messianic community and the Christian community in other ways. For instance, the Christian community might have that distinction when it comes to alcohol or dress or things like that aren't necessarily frontline things in the Jewish community, where in the Christian community, modesty of dress is much more in the prevalence of the life than it would be in a conservative or a reform temple, where in the Orthodox world, modesty is very much a big thing.
Yeah, I would just find it hard as especially a leader in the Messianic movement. I would find it hard to teach Torah observancy in the arena of believing in Messiah Yeshua. Obviously, in the context of believing in Messiah Yeshua, I would have a hard time teaching that if I'm not doing it. And again, I just think it's really it's a very bad look to tell Gentiles, okay, you can only do this much of it, or you can participate if you want, but yet you have the right to gatekeep it, or just leave it if you want. And that to me is a bad look.
Yeah, right. And just, going off of what we discussed about the statement of faith, like, if I'm honest, that's not much different than a very conservative evangelical church that loves Israel and takes trips to Israel and sends financial support to Israel and things like that, and embraces teaching from the Old Testament and using that, and it's not abrogated but not necessarily followed. Kind of still looked at the same way of like, oh, we're Christians, we don't do that. So I think I guess my question should be more, should we have a baseline as Messianic leaders? Where's the baseline? Because you can't, it makes it, like kind of like Toby was saying, it looks really bad if you have some Messianic leaders who are, let's say, more open to, everyone, including Gentiles, coming in, but they're teaching, okay, here's what we do here, what you do in your house, that's up to you, between you and God. But, here, and what we do in our own lives as leaders is we, we're at least not eating pork, not eating shellfish, and eating the things that we should eat.
I can tell you our position, and Rabbi Jonathan knows this as a synagogue. Our position is that if you're going to be part of our community, then there's an expectation that you would walk along with our community in the way that we observe. So we don't go to people's houses and inspect their refrigerators or their cupboards or see what's going on. But if you're coming to our congregation, if you're going to be connected with us in a fellowship connection, then when you come, you shouldn't bring unkosher things with you for Oneg. You should observe Shabbat. You shouldn't, whether you're Jewish or non-Jewish, you represent our community. Yeah. And so you shouldn't be going to do things on Shabbat that would violate the standards of the Scripture. And when we talk about that, I'm talking about the plain text of the Scripture. There's lots of rabbinic edicts and things that are added to that aren't necessarily bad. I don't think fences around the commandments are necessarily a bad thing.
And we do lots of them.
Yeah, as long as we understand that those are not the commandment, those are fences around the commandment that assist us in walking out our lives. But I think that as a community, I can't really be concerned for every human being in the world. I mean, we should have some concern, but my role as a shepherd is to shepherd the flock that God has given me. And so that's my primary concern, and those that want to join our flock. So, and it's important, it's also important when we talk about these things to understand that we're not talking about it in a legalistic way. Everything that we talk about here on this program or in our synagogue is based upon a heart change that brings around a observance change, and not the other way around. Matter of fact, we were talking earlier, I have a friend who's a Messianic rabbi who saw my seat or my fringes on my clothes, and he said, "Oh, you wear those still?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "I used to wear those, but God convicted me and told me I was being legalistic." And so I answered him by saying, "Isn't it possible to observe the commandments of God without being legalistic?" I mean, in other words, nobody would say, "I'm being legalistic by not committing adultery, so I'm just going to start committing adultery because I don't want to be legalistic,"
right?
Or idolatry, or any of those things. We don't look at it that way. But for some reason, there are certain commandments like kashrut or like Shabbat keeping or whatever that people say, "Oh, if you try to do that, you're being legalistic." But I don't think we have to be that way. I think that we can actually do something in service to God out of love for God, right, and not out of obligation to a written code or a written list.
I think the question, though, becomes how do we, as a community, Messianic Judaism is already established is a scattered mix of different opinions and approaches to Scripture and how to live it out and what have you. How do we present a unity when we are so scattered in tradition? I mean, what we look at with the various denominations of Christianity, right, is they're all divided, and they're all divided over typically relatively simple issues. And it's usually a tradition or a belief of tradition that they have in their denomination that's different than everyone else's, and that's what separates them. And they're very intentional on drawing these boundary lines around that. Well, within Messianic Judaism, first off, it's a small community, right? And there are two major rabbinic/congregational organizations, the UMJC and the IMCS. And then there are varying smaller organizations like Tikkun and a few others that are out there. But how far can we thin out what is already a small entity in order to kind of congregate around every little detail we agree upon? And I think this goes back to the question that Rabbi Jonathan asked, was should there be a baseline? And I think the reality is that there needs to be some sort of a baseline. What that looks like, I don't necessarily have an answer for, but there needs to be some sort of a baseline, because currently what happens is a leader gets upset or feels like they're not heard or whatever because they believe that something should be added into the way that we do things, right? Whether it's a leadership structure that they feel needs to be more inclusive of more people involved in that leadership, or exclusive or whatever, or they feel it needs to be, Messianic Judaism needs to look more rabbinic or less rabbinic or what have you, and they'll break away and start their own thing that fits the model they're looking for, right? But the problem is we're too small, and either we're an end-time revival or we're not. And if we're as small as we are, how are we to cohesively maintain unity in a way that doesn't push people away, in a way that doesn't make other rabbis feel awkward, in a way that doesn't make the whole movement look hypocritical? Because when some say we do this, and then others, like I have people ask me all the time in our congregation, "Hey, what does Messianic Judaism think about X, Y, or Z?" And my answer is typically, well, I can tell you what we think here at this congregation, but there isn't a unified consensus in Messianic Judaism. I mean, even on something as simple as should we or shouldn't we keep the Shabbat, there isn't a unified consensus. And there should be.
Actually, what does it mean to keep the Shabbat? Not should we or shouldn't we, but what does that mean? But I think that part of the answer to this, I think, can be the same answer that we use locally. In other words, at our synagogue, this is our halakha. This is how we as a group do this. So when we gather together at a conference or an event or something that's put on by the movement, there should be at this event, we're going to abide by this standard as a group. And just like we wouldn't go to somebody's house to inspect their house, we're not going to come to your individual congregations and see if you're living up to this. But as a movement, as a people group, when we're together, when people are looking, there should be a minimum that we adhere to, just like there is at our local synagogues. And so when somebody comes, for instance, we had people from one of our congregations that went on an event, a cruise, with a large Messianic organization, and they went there as reasonably new people in the movement. So they had adopted kashrut and certain things in their life, kosher food. For those that may not understand what kashrut is, they adopted that in their life. But then they went to this event that was led by some of the more well-known Messianic leaders who were not, they were eating shrimp and lobster and such on the cruise ship. And they came back and were very disheartened,
right?
Because they felt like, here's what I thought this was, and now I find out that the leadership is doing this, and they couldn't meld that,
justify it.
Yeah. So it became a real thing that we had to deal with and explain and all that.
Yeah.
When it comes to something like that, if we're doing a conference or we're doing something, then the food should be kosher. Now, I appreciate, for instance, I went to a union conference, and I appreciate the fact that everything they had there was vegetarian, so as to make sure everybody was comfortable. If there's no meat, you don't have to worry about the level of kashrut. Was it hectored? Was it killed the right way? Was all of the stuff? We just took that. We said we're just going to eat vegetarian meals, and that way everybody will have a minimum.
Yeah,
acceptable to everybody, and it's only a few days. We can all survive on vegetarian food, and that way we can all be unified, and we won't have a stumbling block that causes division while we're gathered together.
Yeah, I just again, it upsets me a little bit, to when I think about, because non-Jews in the Messianic movement are like the easiest to pick on, right?
Sure.
And it tells me that some folks need to spend more time than maybe being critical or discussing or addressing the fact that you have Messianic Jewish leaders not doing this stuff, rather than trying to patrol or gatekeep what you think non-Jews should be doing.
And not only that,
because it's like almost like it's this. What you're saying is that Jewish people have the privilege to take or leave it, but Gentiles just simply need to stay away.
Yeah, but even when we talk about this, Paul in his writings deals with similar issues where he says, "I have liberty, but I don't allow my liberty to become a stumbling block to someone else." In other words, even if I believed that I could eat shrimp and pork and all of that,
right.
and if I were in a group of people that might not have that same understanding or belief, I would not do something that was going to cause a problem. Just like if I know somebody's an alcoholic and they come to my house, I'm not pouring wine, because I don't want to become a stumbling block before them.
Yeah.
If there's certain things that we just make a choice to not do, that we may even feel we have liberty to do, but we don't do it because we don't have liberty to become a stumbling block or a problem maker for our brothers and sisters.
Right.
We're supposed to prefer our brother. We're supposed to make a choice to subject ourselves to the needs of other people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for me, it becomes like because we go to the conferences and things, and we'll hear it. It's harped on, it's preached on. The IMCS is different, it's distinct, it's separate. The MJA, it's different, it's distinct, it's separate. Any of the Messianic groups will often say that in their gathering points. And then you get down to like this kind of, kashrut is like a that's like if you say to someone, "Oh, they're Jewish," that's immediately one of the first 5 things I'm sure that comes to the mind. Oh, they don't eat pork, or they don't eat shrimp. Or it's an identifying marker, like the Shabbat, like the rest of the Torah, of what it means to be Jewish, of the family of Jacob, of the people of God. And so, to me, when it turns into is like, oh, we're Jewish, and our identifying markers are wearing Stars of David and throwing Hebrewish terms in our songs.
Yeah, it actually makes me think.
Yeah, it becomes this ridiculous thing where it's like, okay, so rather than taking the identifying markers that God gave you, you're just gonna do some cultural.
It actually
things.
makes me think of the congressperson from New York, Santos, who claimed he was Jew-ish. Like, I'm not Jewish, I'm Jew-ish. I'm kind of like a Jew. I'm not actually a Jew. I'm not following those things. I don't go to synagogue. I don't keep kosher. But I'm similar. I'm like a kosher style dill pickle.
Yeah.
Instead of a kosher pickle. I'm kosher like. I'm Jew-ish.
Yeah.
Where we should not ever present ourselves in an ish way.
Right. I'm just going to I guess not switch gears. I mean, it's a bit, but just to give you guys this is a time just that I actually did eat food that wasn't kosher while I was Messianic, and it was when I was invited to dinner. My wife and I were invited to dinner by a coworker that I worked with at the school I worked at when I was a teacher, and I was actively, sharing the Lord with this guy. I wasn't like laying it on thick, but I felt like I was being a witness to this guy, and I was talking to him about the Lord and stuff, and sharing my faith with him. And he wasn't a believer at all, so they invited us to his house. He didn't understand anything about anything Bible, God, Jewish. He just was, everything's cool, but he didn't understand that I kept kosher, and I didn't think to tell him. So we went over to his house, and his wife served this dish with ham in it, and I didn't say anything. I ate. Why? Because in that situation, I was not. If I said, "I'm sorry, I can't eat that," and then I could possibly hurt her feelings, embarrass her, and none of those things are good for the most important thing I was trying to communicate to them, and that was the gospel. But if I'm on a cruise ship and I just decide to pile shrimp on my plate, well, that's got nothing to do with the gospel. I'm just wanting to eat shrimp.
Yeah, I can't tell you the number of times that I've gone and spoke at a church and had the pastor walk me to the dinner on the grounds or to their fellowship hall and say, "Man, we just put on a huge dinner for you, a special honor, and everything on the table is pork or catfish or shrimp or crawfish or whatever." And now I will not say to them, "I can't believe how insulting you are that you did this," but I won't eat those things there. What I'll do is say, "Oh, I'm trying to cut back. I'm just going to have salad or
everybody would do what I would have done.
Trying to cut back on having triple bypass
but I just
surgery
felt
in 30
like
years.
It was offered out of kindness. I ate what was put before me.
Right.
And in the end, I just want to say, after working with that guy for a couple of years, I remember he gave me a book which was They Thought for Themselves. He got me that book and said, "Your faith is inspiring." So, the Lord had an impact on him through me, and I felt like in a situation like that, I didn't feel convicted about eating treif because the gospel was at the forefront of my mind.
Yeah.
So I think it's just important that we understand there are exceptions to rules. For instance, we had a family that came to our synagogue that hadn't eaten in 3 days, and they came on Shabbat. And so after Shabbat, I invited them to my house, and then I ordered food because we didn't have enough food prepared at our house to feed this family, but I wasn't going to let them go another day without eating. So where I normally wouldn't buy food on Shabbat, I went ahead and bought it for them because it was important that they ate and that we demonstrated love and kindness to them. Where if we just decided, hey, let's get a bunch of people come over to the house to hang out on Shabbat, we would never consider just doing it in that case. So in the case of you're doing it, you're trying to reach this person, and if they went through the effort to make a meal for you, then it makes sense that you would partake of the meal without trying to insult them or make the wife or the husband feel bad about it. But that's a separate, those are exceptions to the rule, not the rule. And as the rule, whether we are Jewish or non-Jewish, in a communal sense, as an example of what Messianic Judaism is as Judaism.
Right.
We should have a measure of observance that is recognizable as Judaism, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
Well, because otherwise there's no reason to be separate from the church.
Right. Otherwise, we could just call ourselves something else.
Yeah, which is the point that Jonathan was making before we started this episode when we were talking about this issue was, why go through the headache of making all these arguments about the distinctions of the Jewish people, the distinctions of Messianic Judaism versus, and not versus as in like a competitive sense, but versus the church or whatever else, if we're not going to do anything that is distinct. Like, okay, you play Shabbat, great. What good does that do? Like you have if you have a church service on a Saturday, okay, awesome. It's still a church service. Like, what makes your service Jewish? Is it just that you meet on Saturdays, or is it that you're doing stuff that is identifiably Jewish within that context? And so the reality is that as Rabbi Jonathan was saying, is there are distinctions that should be something that makes us distinct from the rest of the body of Messiah.
And while this is a change kind of the discussion within the discussion, one of the things that makes us that way beyond Shabbat observance, beyond kashrut, is our liturgical service. We do prayers that are traditional liturgy prayers that have been handed down for thousands of years that connect us to the Jewish people, but it's not just that. Those prayers, that when we open up our Siddur and we go through the order of the Siddur, we're following the order of temple service, we're following the order of the morning offering, the afternoon offering, the evening offering, which is how God commanded His people to worship Him. So when we worship in accordance with what God leads us to do and instructed us to do, even if we can't make the sacrifices, even if there's no temple, even if there's no priesthood, even if those things aren't there, our service mirrors and symbolically participates in that system, because it's part of what makes us part of Israel. Whether you're natural born or grafted in, whether you're the wild branch or the natural branch, whatever, our body is the olive tree, that olive tree of Israel. And so while we do things, one of the things we do, we eat kosher to some extent, to some reason, depending on how that is, whether it's nominal or what they call biblical to glot kosher or Orthodox. We keep Shabbat, and whether that's we don't do anything or turn on lights or tear toilet paper to, we just mentioned that it is Shabbat. But our liturgy is part of what establishes us as a unique body connected to the biblical Israel in how we're doing it. It's not just Hebrewish. It's not just that we use a Hebrew term or a Hebrew word, or we pepper our messages with Hebrew terms, but there's a reason for it that connects us to the greater body, to Lador Vador, from generation to generation. So all of this is part of what we do, and it's not just, we don't just keep kosher because it's something, it's like a badge of honor. We get the kosher merit badge, or we get the Shabbat merit badge, or whatever, but it's supposed to be part of who we are, and we're supposed to be identifiably kadosh, identifiably separate from the other, whatever the other is.
Right.
Yeah. Because I can tell you, as someone who stopped eating pork when I was still in the Christian camp, I wasn't Messianic at all. I wasn't even pursuing the idea of Messianic. I was like, a heavy conviction to stop eating pork. I was like, Jesus wouldn't be eating pork. Why am I eating pork?
Right.
And I stopped. And so, to me, it's just, and if we're about to wrap up, this will be kind of like my closing thing, is that there needs to be a baseline within the Messianic movement, for at least for large conferences and things, and what you do when you're around large gatherings of people.
Anything that represents Messianic
and
Judaism.
Anything that represents. So if you're going to record and put it online, it needs to be there. That baseline needs to be adhered to, because otherwise, I can tell you, as someone who, who came in from the Gentile side of things, it looks deceitful, and it gives the anti-missionaries ammunition, and it actually makes them right.
Right, and it actually makes us look. When Paul goes to Jerusalem, Yaakov tells him, we want to show the people that you are not teaching people to violate the Torah in the nations. And so what we want you to do is go to the temple and make this sacrifice and offering for yourself and these other men. And Paul does that. And if we do our observance in a way that people will say, well, Paul didn't actually believe that. He just did it to deceive the Jewish people into thinking he was Jewish. In other words, there are Jewish community people, the anti-missionaries that say Messianic rabbis, people like me, aren't really Jewish anymore. We only do Jewish shtick so that we can lead Jewish people astray from God and from the ways of God. And if we do what we do in that manner, where we're doing it just for a show instead of a real heartfelt, real thing that's connective to us, then we're doing what people claim Paul did, which was to pretend he was Jewish to the Jewish people so he could deceive them when he was really starting a new religion called Christianity, which is not at all accurate. And we need to have a baseline or a way that we do things unified so that we don't appear to be the deceitful people that people claim we are, that we're just Christians wearing Jewish garb or having Jewish peppered songs or whatever.
So let me ask this. In a environment such as this, like as a podcast where we're just talking about the various issues and things that exist within Messianic Judaism or peripheral to Messianic Judaism, it's easy to have this conversation. And honestly, the four of us, for the most part, I would say probably 99% of the time, agree on all of these issues we're talking about already. Yeah. So for us having this conversation, it's a super easy conversation to have because we're all on the same page, right? Yeah. The question I have is how would the Messianic community broach having this conversation on a grander scale, opening up a legitimate and healthy conversation to develop and establish that baseline? How does that conversation get presented or even promoted within the community? Because in a lot of cases, like, for instance, a rabbi forum that we're all a part of, a conversation about whether or not Gentiles should keep kosher, within probably 7 or 8 emails in the chain is going to get shut down hard because all of a sudden it's an uncomfortable conversation. Somebody's going to say something that everybody didn't like or whatever. How do we have a conversation like this on a grander scale that actually broaches that idea of setting up a healthy baseline and doing so, one, with the intention of unity? Because that's the foremost. If we can't get there, then there is no baseline. But that should be the starting point.
Right. If it's not about unity of heart, then it's just pretend.
Yeah. Yeah. You're just advocating your opinion.
But I think it's important that we do so. The question then becomes, if we were to establish a unified halakha for our organization, if we were to actually gather a group of people together that said, okay, this is how we as the letters, as the whatever acronym we're part of, are going to live our life out communally, at least when we're gathered together. Would establishing a halakha like that change our nature from a loose affiliation of congregations to a denominational structure, and would that then change our who we are fundamentally to a different, and would that be a bad thing or a good thing?
I'd like to answer David's first, just for my own thoughts. Is I think years ago, and I know the MLR kind of became something different over the years, but I think and there's kind of two different responses to what's happening with that in the cyberspace of Messianic Judaism, we'll call it, floating around. That one, it's never coming back. The other answer is that it's going to come back to be more like it was, where it was the gathering of senior leaders and maybe assistant leaders. I don't know, but definitely senior leaders of congregations across the board, across IMCS, Union, Tikkun. I think maybe you could have something like that, where they come together and actually, like, with the purpose of identifying baseline, like here's what people need to see when they come into your congregations. Here's just a you can do more. If you want to have a kitchen in your synagogue that separates meat and dairy, go for it. But at a minimum, no shrimp Tuesdays. That kind of thing. And so I just want to answer it.
So circling back to your question, Rabbi Eric, I am personally of the mindset that I think 40 plus years into the congregational movement of the Messianic Jewish movement, I think we're probably at a point in time where we need to establish something more akin to a denominational approach. If for no other reason than unity, because right now there are so many scattered representations, and there are so many things on the peripheral that put on a show of being a representation, but are vastly different. And it's really hard for us to say, well, they're not real because they're not like us. But then there's also congregations in our organization that are also not like us in any way, shape, fashion, or form that would look closer to what they are than what that we are. And having all of, so I personally think if we're going to have even a remote conversation about what we aren't, we need to first define what we actually are. And I think going towards a more denominational structure is a need.
And I think it goes actually beyond what we are to what do we want to be. What is our goal? Yeah, we're a loose amalgamation of congregations right now that fellowship together. But is there more? Do we want to be more? Do we want to have the structure that allows for instance, more support for one another, more encouragement for one another? What about having our own yeshiva that's actually part of our organization, that's actually not just something where people do video teaching, but actually have, every known group, denomination, or whatever you want to call it, within 50 years of their establishment had their own university or their own college that they would send students to build, to educate. We don't have that yet. All these groups have groups that help with finances, with different things that groups need and support, to share information, to help one another. All those kind of things that having more of a denominational structure, even if we don't want to use the word denomination, would allow us to grow toward
about the word functional.
Functional. It's kind of like when you look up a Major League Baseball team on the web, all of their websites look the same. It doesn't matter what team it is. You type in Mets and then you type in Cubs, or you type in anybody but the Yankees. You never want to type in the Yankees. But when it comes up, their website looks the same. They're identifiably part of the Major League Baseball group. Messianic Judaism, I'm not advocating all our websites to look the same, but Messianic Judaism should look recognizably the same.
Yeah.
Even though we're different teams, so to speak, even though we're in different communities and different cities, somebody should be able to come to our congregation from California and feel like they recognize us as part of the organism that they're part of.
Because and we talked about the differences between halakhic observances between even the other branches of Judaism. But regardless, if I go to an Orthodox synagogue in Central Florida, and then I go to an Orthodox synagogue in New York, the worship is going to be almost the same.
Yeah, the experience.
It's going to be almost. It's going to be like the baseline is going to be the same. There's going to be prayers. There's going to be psalms sung. There's going to be reading from the Torah. There's going to be the rabbi is going to speak. And I'm not even talking about just that. I'm talking about that's a kind of off where we are when it comes to giving examples, because the examples that we're talking about with example to Sabbath observance and kashrut and things, those are more important because God actually said to do that.
Right. So I think we can continue this discussion on another program episode as it comes up. If you have comments or questions or things you'd like to throw out to us, please connect with us through our social media, through YouTube, through the different channels that our podcast is on. If you haven't already done so, share our podcast with your friends that it might be a blessing to, and tune in again next week.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics Podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.